Welcome to the OK, Let's Learn podcast. This is two family-friendly podcasts in one where we dive into tons of interesting books and stories, and another where we just dive into tons of interesting topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, okay, let's learn all about fertilizers and pesticides. Yep, that's right. Hey, listen. It's all about keeping our lawn green, but it's so much more, right? It's all about feeding our lawn, feeding our plants, feeding everything that we need in terms of having food for ourselves. But it also is about making sure that when we take care of our lawns and we take care of all these wonderful plants that end up giving us food, that we're being safe with the environment. It's a delicate balance. So we will dive into everything. What is fertilizer? What is a pesticide? And the history. And again, so much of what we see out there. Hey, I have had my lawn for almost 34 years. And there's a lawn up the street. The house was vacant for 15 years. The lawn was horrible, of course. I mean, you just have every weed out there possible. And then all of a sudden, brand new house, and they cleared everything, threw in new soil. And then in a matter of months, the lawn is perfectly manicured and perfectly green. And I look at it compared to mine. I said, what's going on? Well, listen, as you know, with landscaping, lawn care, fertilizing, it costs money, right? But again, so much of taking care of our lawns, farmers being able to produce more and more food, right? It is important that we know what fertilizers and pesticide is all about. So, okay, let's learn. So what is fertilizer? Well, like I said, it helps plants grow by giving them the nutrients they need. That's really the simplest way to explain it. If you've ever looked at a bag of lawn fertilizer, there's actually 3 numbers on the bag. Listen to this. Those 3 numbers have to do with 3 important nutrients that the plants all need: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But what are all those 3? Well, nitrogen is a chemical element that's all around us. In fact, most of the air we breathe is not oxygen. It's nitrogen gas. Did you know that? Plants need nitrogen to make things like proteins and chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is that green material that helps them use sunlight to make food, right? Photosynthesis. That's why nitrogen is really important for the green leafy growth in plants. Phosphorus? Well, that's another naturally occurring chemical element. It's found in rocks and soil. And what do the plants need it for? Well, it needs it really for their growing roots and for storing and transferring energy and making the flowers and the seeds. Potassium, again, another naturally occurring chemical, right? And is found in rocks and soils. And it helps control a lot of the plant's functions. And it helps the plant deal with like all the stresses that it normally has, which, obviously heat, cold, disease, bugs, you name it, right? And up front, which we haven't mentioned, talk about cost of our lawn. And this particular summer, this is out there, I'm sending this out to the world, this episode in the summer of 2026, towards the tail end. And here in Jersey, we've had so much rain. I haven't watered the lawn at all. And boy, is it looking good. Water is the key thing. But we're talking about fertilizer, right? And pesticides because, yes, it's not just water. And to make it ideal, when we don't have enough water or maybe we have too much, right? The fertilizer and the pesticides can help out. So these 3, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, are commonly referred to as NPK, Nancy, Peter, Kevin. They come from the periodic table. The symbol for nitrogen is N. The symbol for phosphorus is P. And the symbol for potassium is K. So that's where the NPK comes from. So what's a pesticide? So this is where it kind of can get confusing, right? Because they're not the same thing, pesticides and fertilizer. The fertilizer feeds the plant, and the pesticide controls something that we consider a pest. And, right, that's where the umbrella term comes from, right? Now, it is an umbrella term because underneath pesticide, you have an herbicide which kills or controls unwanted plants, which we usually call weeds. Then there's insecticide, right? And that controls insects. You got fungicides. Yes, that controls fungi. And that includes things like molds, mildews. These fungi can cause diseases in plants. And then, how about this one? Rodenticide. Yes. Have you ever heard of that one? Well, you can figure it out. Yep, it controls rodents, rats or mice. So there's others, but these are the main ones. And here's the easy way to remember it when we're talking about pesticides. If you put something on your lawn to give the grass nutrients, that's fertilizer. If you put something on your lawn to kill a dandelion, that's a pesticide. If you're going to control an insect, notice the word, control, right? You're using an insecticide. And so here's the word that a lot of you may have heard, especially those of you that have yards, that take care of your lawn. Weed and feed. It's basically two jobs put into one product, right? The feed is the fertilizer, weed is the herbicide. Both can be put into one bag. So fertilizer is actually really old. People have been fertilizing plants for thousands of years. Of course, ancient farmers didn't walk into a store and buy a bag, right? But they used things like animal manure, ashes, compost, and other materials that they discovered that helped their crops grow. They didn't understand why. They just saw that it worked. If you kept growing crops in the same soil year after year, eventually those crops are not going to grow as well. But if you put certain materials back into the soil, right, yes, they noticed that the crops would grow better. Over time, people started figuring out why. In the 1800s, they started figuring out what it was that they needed from the soil. One important scientist was this German chemist. His name was Justus von Liebig. He helped scientists understand that plants needed certain type of mineral nutrients, right? What's that? Well, a mineral nutrient is simply an element that a plant gets from its environment and needs in order to grow. Then in England, John Bennett Laws developed one of the first commercially successful phosphate fertilizers in the 1840s. It goes back to then. But there was a big problem with all this, and it was nitrogen. What? Now, walk through this with me. Why is this a problem? Well, this is all about the plants getting what it needs to grow, right? And why is this an issue, right? Well, we got to have food to eat. So a lot of people don't know this. Everything around us, 78% of the air that's around us is nitrogen, right? So it's everywhere. The problem is that most plants can't simply get that nitrogen gas out of the air and use it. Well, all right. Well, fertilizers weren't around that we weren't putting into the ground before. So nature, you see, has always been doing the job. Certain bacteria that live in the soil and some that live around the roots of plants, such as peas, beans, and clovers, they can take nitrogen gas from the air and change it into forms that plants can eventually use. Lightning, believe it or not, can also convert a small amount of nitrogen into usable forms. And when plants and animals pass away or produce waste, right, nitrogen is returned to the soil as those materials break down. The problem became for farmers when they would grow crops and harvest them year after year. They kept removing nitrogen from the soil that was naturally occurring. Eventually, nature couldn't always replace it fast enough. So farmers used things like manure and rotating crops to help put the nitrogen back. But as they tried to grow more and more food, they needed a better way to replace it. And that's where the modern nitrogen fertilizer comes into the story and why it's so important that we're talking about this. So what was the big breakthrough? How did this happen? Well, it was a German chemist, Fritz Haber, 1909. He figured out a way to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and use it to make ammonia. Ammonia, we know about ammonia, right? Well, it's a compound made from nitrogen and hydrogen, and it can be used to make fertilizer that provides nitrogen in a form that the plants can eventually use. Imagine this, what people were able to do. Science is so important, right? And you can see the examples. Well, another German scientist and engineer, his name was Carl Bosch, he figured out how to do this on a huge scale. So you have this process today. It's called the Haber-Bosch process, right? So this became the big deal. Now nitrogen fertilizer could be produced in huge amounts. Farmers would put nitrogen back into the soil and grow more food, right? So this is why fertilizer became so important. It was about feeding us. As populations grew, farmers needed to produce more and more food. They only have a certain amount of land, and it's the same land. Well, the fertilizer helped them do that, and it still does. But here's the other important part about fertilizer. People learn something else. Too much of it can cause problems. So let's say you put fertilizer in your lawn, and you get a huge rainstorm. This summer, it's happened a lot. The grass is going to use some of those nutrients, but some of it's going to wash away. If it washes into the street, it goes down the storm drain and eventually ends up, in streams, ponds, or lakes. And remember, fertilizer makes plants grow. Well, it can also make things grow in water too. Too much nitrogen or phosphorus in the water can cause large amounts of algae to grow. Algae are simple organisms that live in water and use sunlight to grow, somewhat like plants do. If too much algae grows and then dies and decomposes, it can reduce the amount of oxygen in the water. That can cause problems for fish and other animals. So that's one of the environmental concerns with fertilizer. I'm sure you've heard this and you were thinking this when we started the episode, right? So fertilizer isn't a case of if some is good, more must be better. No, you want to use the amount that the plants actually need. So, pesticides. Well, they have a long history too. People have been trying to protect their crops, you can imagine, right? From insects and other pests for thousands of years. So modern pesticides really took off in the 1900s. One of the most famous was called DDT, David Tom. And are you ready for this? 32 letters. This is why they call it DDT. DDT is dichlorodyphenyl-trichloroethane. Oh my goodness, 32 letters. I really, again, I'm 64. I don't think I've ever pronounced a word longer than this. I mean, this is 1874. I could just do a whole podcast on why this word is so long. Are you kidding me? So it was this DDT. It's a human-made chemical compound. Like I said, it was first produced in the late 1800s. At the time, though, nobody knew that it could be used to kill insects. That came much later. In 1939, a Swiss chemist, his name was Paul Hermann Muller, he discovered that DDT was actually, really helpful for killing insects. During World War II, it became especially important because it could kill insects, right? Like the really serious ones like mosquito, lice, that were spreading serious diseases. After the war, farmers began using it to protect their crops. And of course, you can understand why. If insects are destroying your food, and now suddenly somebody gives you something that can kill those insects, that's a big deal. Pesticides help farmers not only protect crops, but obviously with that, they were able to make more food. And listen, you talk about getting rid of diseases worldwide. We're talking about getting rid of insects that really, right, ravaged the world with malaria and yellow fever. So this was a big deal. But like fertilizers, scientists discovered that the DDT could remain in the environment for a long time and build up in animals. So it was causing problems too. I mean, really, it became so bad that it was banned in 1972. It was especially known because of a lot of its effects on certain birds. It caused some birds to produce thinner eggshells, which meant more eggs could break before the baby birds hatched. So this is, again, another important lesson, right? You roll something out and you certainly see the immediate benefits, but you don't very often see the downsides. So that's one reason today that pesticides are regulated big time. In the United States, the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, it evaluates pesticides before they can be registered to be used. The EPA is obviously the federal agency that's responsible for protecting our health and the environment. Pesticides labels can also tell you how those products are supposed to be used, and that's important. Different pesticides have different chemicals, and they don't have all the same risk. So, how did all of these fertilizers and pesticides, how did they end up on our lawns? I mean, we have these lawn care companies that come and they fertilize our lawns, right? There's separate companies other than the landscapers that just cut your lawn. And you've got, I think in my case, 5 or 6 treatments throughout the years. And then, of course, we all know Scott's, right? Scott's was founded by Orlando McLean Scott in Ohio in 1868. That's how far back it goes. He was originally selling weed-free seed to farmers, but by the early 1900s, the company was selling grass seed to homeowners, and then in 1928, it introduced Turf Builder. Talk about a iconic brand that's out there in this industry. It was a fertilizer made specifically for lawns. Then in 1947, Scott's introduced a product that combined the fertilizer with weed control. Now, obviously, as you know, you could feed your grass and control the weeds at the same time. Weed and feed, that's where it came from. But lawn care really became a huge business, no doubts, with the emergence of suburbia taking off after World War II, especially like obviously in the 50s and the 60s. So really lawn care, it wasn't now just about farms and big estates, parks, or of course golf courses. It's now regular homeowners. So in terms of the applications, here's just a brief description. Here in North Jersey, the typical professional lawn program maybe is 6 applications during the year. In the early spring, the first time you get an application, it includes a fertilizer to get the grass growing, right? Along with what they call a pre-emergent herbicide to stop crabgrass before it comes up. The second application in later spring usually includes more fertilizer and some more weed control for things like dandelions and clover. Then in the early summer, the lawn may get another feeding along with treatment for grubs and other insects. So that's when you get the insecticide, right? That can damage the grass. Late summer application, that's when you really help it get through the heats, and it may include some insect or weed control. Early fall, the fertilizer helps the grass recover, right, from the summer and grow stronger roots. And then finally, you get the late fall, right? One final application, and they usually refer to this as like a winterizer. It strengthens the roots and it prepares the grass for winter and obviously the following spring. And now along with this, the separate services in terms of, your landscaper, you got an air raid, which is basically used with the machine where they poke thousands of small holes into the soil, and it loosens the compacted soil, and it allows more air and water and nutrients to reach the roots. And usually along with that, they'll overseed so that, the seeds will eventually grow into the existing lawn to make it thicker. So the question is, and you may be thinking this, is this all necessary? Really, what is exactly a healthy lawn, right? If you want it to look like a golf course, yeah. There's not going to be any dandelions, no clover, no crabgrass, no weeds at all. But I come down on the side where, you know what? You have a few of those, your lawn is normal. It's not going to be perfect, but normal is normal, and I'll go for that. Now, as we wrap up the podcast, we have to talk about the drawbacks, right? We've talked about how fertilizer can go into waterways and pesticides, right? They control pests, but if they're not used properly, they can pose risks to people or animals depending upon the particular chemical, the amount, and how much someone is exposed to it. That's why there's rules about how these products are used. That's why you have the signs on the lawns after the applications in terms of just us walking on them, but of course your pets and your dogs. I see it all over my neighborhoods, right? The warnings are there for a reason. A professional lawn care company may need certifications or licenses depending upon what it's applying and where you live, right? And again, I'm talking about my area, but obviously fertilizers and lawn care is going to be different wherever you live in the world, and they can have different rules depending upon where you live. Now, something we haven't mentioned, it's just not enough to put fertilizer, pesticide on your lawn, and then, you're going to snap your fingers and everything's going to work. You've got to water the lawn. So again, you talk about money. In my case, right, we've never went out and spent the money for a sprinkler system, but you got to water the lawn. It's got to be strategic in terms of the time. Ideally, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. That's when it needs to be done. It can't be done in the heat of the day because it's just going to evaporate. It's not going to do its job. So not too much water, not too little, not too much sun, not too much shade, right? So all of this gets into the picture. And then also, listen to this, right? The soil itself. You've got to apply lime. You've probably heard this, right? Why you apply lime? Well, you need it to balance the soil pH so the roots can actually absorb the nutrients, right? And finally, don't forget when you mow the lawn. Ideally, you got to let it grow, and then you got to have it on the highest setting. You can't cut it too short, because then if you're unlucky and you don't water the lawn and you got a prolonged drought, there you go. That grass is dead, right? So there's a lot to go into lawn care. It's just not the fertilizer and the pesticides. But since this has been a podcast about fertilizers, all about fertilizers and pesticides, the fertilizers help farmers grow more food. The pesticides help the farmers protect that food, right? Both are important and both have to be used carefully. And yes, both can be used to have your lawn look nice and green. Friends, thanks for taking this journey, learning all about fertilizers and pesticides. I hope you've picked up a few nuggets along the way. Reach out to me at our new email address, Okletslearnpodcast@gmail.com. We also have a website, Okletslearn.com. We are on Facebook. We are on Spotify. We are on YouTube. We are on X. We are on Substack. Hey, just Google OK Let's Learn. You'll be able to listen to the podcast. And yes, if you're so inclined, really appreciate it. If you'd like to support the show and be a producer of the show, look in the show notes where it says support the show on patreon.com. Appreciate the ratings. Appreciate the reviews. And until next time, have fun and keep learning.